Hello, and welcome to our audience from around the world for this week's edition of Oxford at Home, our continuing series to showcase new research, thinking, and ideas coming from all around the University of Oxford, while we remain, at least for a few more weeks, in the UK government's current national lockdown. But although our bodies may be confined, at least at the moment, to our houses and our Wi-Fi, so do remember, bear with us if we do brown out for just a few seconds. We will do our best to get straight back, but we are literally, in most cases, working from home. Even if we're confined that way, ideas can spread all around the globe and beyond. And we're going to hear today a talk that deals with some of the biggest issues that touch the present day, while being very much grounded in deep and rich history. My name is Rana Mitter. I teach Chinese history here at the university, but today my role is to introduce our speaker, and I'll tell you about him in just a moment. Just a reminder that we're going to hear from him for about 15 minutes and then have about 15 minutes for questions, and you can send in questions through the chat window on YouTube or the comments section of Twitter or Facebook. That's just by way of preamble before we get to the main event. And our main event today, I'm delighted to say, is one of our wonderful colleagues here at the University of Oxford, a fellow of Balliol College and a professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations. He is Dr. Sudhir Hazarisingh. His book from 2006, The Legend of Napoleon, won a major prize, the Prix d'Histoire of the Fondation Napoleon, and his subsequent book, In the Shadow of the General, was given the History Prize of 2010 by the French Senate. So for an academic working out of Britain to be thus honoured in France, as I'm sure many of you will know, is a rare and welcome accolade indeed. But it's his newest book that is our subject of discussion today. He is the author most recently of a fantastic biography, I can say that having read and hugely enjoyed it, Black Spartacus, The Epic Life of Toussaint Louverture, shortlisted for the 2020 Baillie Gifford Prize and the subject of the talk today. You may have heard it read on BBC Radio 4, where none less than the great actor Adrian Lester read it out as their book of the week. And describing his own work, Sudhir once said the most rewarding part of his role was, and I quote, "the absolute freedom I've had to roam across the field of French history, politics, and political culture." Well, I have to say the most frustrating, he says, was the decline in the interest in the study of history amongst my colleagues in political science. So hopefully we will get to put that somewhat right today. Might I hand over now for 15 minutes on Toussaint Louverture to Sudhir. Sudhir, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rana, for that generous introduction, and thank you for having me today. It's a real pleasure to be talking to you and to all our viewers and listeners about this wonderful person, Toussaint Louverture, that I've had the privilege of spending the last 3 or 4 years researching. I'll start by just giving you a very quick description of who he was and what his life was, and then I'll just sketch out 5 ways in which I think this story is important, interesting, and continues to be relevant for our times. So who was Toussaint? I describe him in a slightly tongue-in-cheek way in the book as the first Black superhero of modern times. He's someone who led the enslaved people of Saint-Domingue, which was a French colony in the 18th century, towards their freedom. He basically forced the French to recognize that slaves needed to be liberated, and that's what led the French Legislative Assembly, the Convention, to abolish slavery in 1794. He then becomes the leading figure in the politics of the Caribbean colony of Saint-Domingue in the 1790s. He fights off the British and the Spanish, rises to the rank of general in the French Republican Army. And, as I describe in the book, gradually eliminates his domestic and metropolitan French rivals, establishes commercial links with the United States. And by the early 19th century, by 1800, 1801, he's become the dominant political figure in the politics of the colony. He promulgates a constitution which abolishes slavery forever and makes him a governor for life. Unfortunately for Toussaint, this new constitution displeases Napoleon Bonaparte, who by then has become the unchallenged ruler of the French. And Napoleon then sends an army to invade and restore slavery in the colony of Saint-Domingue. Toussaint takes them on initially and fights them back. eventually a sort of compromise is reached, and there's a ceasefire during which Toussaint is captured and shipped off to France, where he dies. But the struggle is continued by Toussaint's lieutenants, and in 1804, Toussaint is no longer on the scene by then, but in 1804, the Haitian army, as it becomes, expels the French from the colony of Saint-Domingue and proclaims the independence of the state of Haiti. And Haiti is, in 1804, is the world's first independent Black post-colonial state. So Toussaint is in very many respects the founding father of this new independent post-colonial Black state. And it's a story really of military heroism, but also of political astuteness and craftsmanship, a story of a man who has extraordinary administrative skills. And I was able, and it was really one of the great privileges of writing this book, I was able to draw on a huge amount of archival material that is mainly in the French colonial archives, but also in Britain, in America, and in Spain. Because one of the very striking things about Saint-Domingue is that it was at the crossroads of various imperial currents and forces in the late 18th and early 19th century. Everyone wanted to get a piece of this real estate because it was a prodigiously wealthy place. It was known as the Pearl of the Antilles. And therefore, there's a lot of source material. But what I was able to draw on particularly were Toussaint's own writings and his own letters and his own speeches. So I really wanted to give this book, through this book, give back a flavor of what he was like, how he thought, what were his particular interests, emotions. So in that sense, it is very much the biography of one person. However, and now I come to the broader themes, I think what is always interesting about one person is the extent to which they're able to tell us interesting things about bigger contextual themes, and even themes that might be of interest to us right up to our present time. And I think there are 5 things here that I'd just like to quickly bring to your attention. Firstly, Toussaint is a revolutionary. And he's a revolutionary who's part of a wider movement. You know, we sometimes think of the late 18th and early 19th century as the age of revolution. And for a long time, we thought, when we thought about the age of revolution, that the big revolutions were the French and the American revolutions, and that the Haitian revolution was this kind of minor little a ripple that happened as a consequence of these 2 other revolutions. And what we find now, and what I certainly found in my research, is that actually it's the other way around. The most radical, the most comprehensive, the most far-reaching revolution of this period is the revolution in Saint-Domingue, and which then becomes Haiti, because it's an anti-imperial revolution. It's a democratic revolution, it's a republican revolution, and it ends, of course, as a war of national liberation. You know, the people of Saint-Domingue join forces in order to fight off the French and expel them from their territory. So Toussaint embodies this revolutionary richness, and I think that's one very important thing that he brings to us. Secondly, of course, this is about slavery. This is the age of slavery. This is the age when people are fighting slavery. And Toussaint is perhaps the most eminent, not perhaps, he is the most eminent combatant in the fight against slavery in the 18th century, because he is the person who leads the most, and indeed the only successful slave revolution of the modern age. And one of the things that we see through Toussaint's story is actually how widespread the fight against slavery was, how there was almost, you might even call it a sort of Black international. There were people fighting slavery who had connections with each other. And of course, Saint-Domingue and Toussaint Louverture himself later become beacons, inspirations for this great revolutionary movement. But Toussaint's story is a story which is at the heart of a social movement of revolt, which is spreading all the way across the Atlantic, and which shows that slaves were people who were taking their own destiny in their own hands. And of course, this story continues well into the 19th century. Thirdly, this is a story about race. And of course, race is an absolutely inescapable part of a story, which is a story about slavery. And Toussaint is really fascinating here because he's someone who thinks very consciously about race, and he thinks about it in not just a very conscious and deliberate way, but also in a very creative and inventive way. He thinks about race, first of all, in terms of the relationship among Black people. One of the things one has to remember when thinking about Saint-Domingue in the late 18th century is that it has 500,000 Black people who are living there, only about 30,000 whites and 30,000 people of mixed race. So there's a huge preponderance of Black people. But these Black people come from different parts of Central and West Africa. They're very divided amongst each other by ethnicity, by religion. They speak different languages. In the late 18th century, only 60% of them, 60% of them were born in Africa. 60% of the slave population was born in Africa. So these are people who do not have what we would call today a shared identity. And this magnificent thing that you see Toussaint doing in a very short period of time is that he takes these disparate and sometimes quite antagonistic Black people or groups of Black people, former slaves, and turns them into a people. That he forges a sense of nationhood among these Black slaves, and that is quite extraordinary. The other thing about his notion of race is that he's a Republican, and he's someone who believes that all people are equal in some fundamental sense. And he's not someone who you would call today a Black nationalist. On the contrary, he believes that Blackness is something that should be seen in terms of equality and fraternity. Brotherhood is the other important component of his thought. And that's, I think, really important to underscore, that he's someone who believed in creating what we would call today a multiracial society. And in a sense, if one is thinking about comparisons between Toussaint and people who lived in our contemporary age, he often reminds me of someone like Mandela, who grew up in a society which was fundamentally racist, and then promoted and advocated racial unity and reconciliation. Because Toussaint's vision for a future Saint-Domingue was one in which Black people, white people, and mixed race people all live together on the basis of equality and harmony. So race is a really interesting dimension of Toussaint in this sense. Fourthly, he's a Republican, and I think this republicanism is something that is very important, and again, very original, because when we think of Toussaint Louverture and the Haitian Revolution, we go back to one of the classic works, which is still a wonderful work to read, and I regard it as one of my Bibles, which is, of course, C.L.R. James's Black Jacobins. And it's still a wonderful book. But C.L.R. James thought of the Saint-Domingue revolutionaries and the Haitian revolutionaries as disciples of the French Revolution, hence the title. These are Jacobins, but Black Jacobins. They're Caribbean Frenchmen. So in C.L.R. James' mind, the Enlightenment is this wonderful thing which is then transposed onto the Caribbean context. But what you see and what I show in the course of analyzing Toussaint Louverture is that actually it's a much richer form of republicanism, because it's a republicanism that is also draws on African motifs, African culture in the broadest sense of the term, military, religious, spiritual. So there are a lot of African elements in Toussaint's own thinking and way of living, as it were. He was born in Saint-Domingue, but his father and mother were African born. And there's also a lot of Caribbean influences in Toussaint's thinking. You know, he spoke Creole, he thought in Creole, he was a devout Catholic, he was someone who knew all about and practiced the Vodou religion. So this is what is interesting about Toussaint Louverture. He's a disciple of the Enlightenment, yes, but he's also someone who brings to his republicanism these African and Caribbean motifs. And this takes me quite naturally to the final element that I wanted to mention, which comes through very strongly in the book. This is a book about a people who are in revolution, but it's also a book about a leader. And leadership is the thing that is so almost magical about Toussaint Louverture. He was someone who was not trained to lead. You know, he grew up on a sugar plantation where he eventually ended up being the coachman. But he didn't go to, he wasn't educated formally. He learned this leadership instinctively, intuitively. But what is so spectacular about him are his personal qualities as a leader. He's someone who worked incredibly hard. You know, he dictated letters to 5 secretaries at one time. He was remarkably intelligent. And he had a strategic vision. That's the thing that really sets him out from the rest of his contemporaries. He's someone who wanted to oppose slavery, fight foreign occupation, and above all, defend the interests and the dignity of the Black people of the colony of Saint-Domingue. And of course, this is a battle that is still being waged right up to this day. In that sense, the story of Toussaint Louverture is one that is still very relevant to our modern and contemporary times. Thank you very much.
Sudhir, thank you very much. That was an absolute tour de force in a very short space of time for what is a long but extremely worthwhile book. So glad that we were able to make that a start point, obviously, rather than an end point of conversation. And while you've been talking, I can tell you a whole variety of people from our audience around the world have been sending in questions. And I will get to those in just a moment, but I wanted to just come back on a couple of things that you've said beforehand. I'm really glad that the last of your 5 points was about leadership, because, you know, not just because this is written as a biography, but also because for a long time, the question of whether or not the individual makes a difference was a slightly unrespectable one in terms of the way that we think about political power and how it's exercised. And I found myself actually, I'll reveal, in the last 24 hours, listening to not one, but 2 great talks on this question, because last night I tuned into a talk by Professor Fred Logoval of Harvard about JFK, and he's just written a wonderful part 1 biography, which is about as long as your entire biography of Sudhir, but I think he's got a lot more childhood material to deal with, possibly. Could be one of the reasons. Could I ask you, just press you a bit more on that question of leadership? I mean, you talk about the fact he worked hard, he was clearly someone who had a strategic vision, but, you know, both of those things, well, the first maybe true, if not necessarily true, the second of, you know, Theresa May, for instance, to give a rather different sort of leader recently. And there was just something there in that case that didn't make it. And I should say, just in case, for obvious reasons, this sounds as if it's gendered, Margaret Thatcher, choosing a rather different sort of figure, had certainly a sense of strategic vision and also worked incredibly hard. But there was also something there that perhaps wasn't there with Theresa May that enabled her to transform beyond. Obviously, with Toussaint, we're looking 200 years in the past. It's not the same as having them before that. Is there something that sort of is more than the sum of the parts that you spotted in him that makes him different from other creditable and hardworking characters of the time?
There are at least 2 things that I think are quite special about him. One is his capacity to integrate existing forms of knowledge wherever they're coming from and make something original out of them. That's why I think it's always a mistake to think of him as a disciple of just one thing. I mean, he's a disciple of many things, but actually what he ends up then producing is something that is original and that is then attuned to the specific conditions of Saint-Domingue. And so, to give you a specific example, he ends up pushing Saint-Domingue towards what we would call today autonomy, right? He didn't advocate independence, But it was something new, and in fact, it was so new that nobody understood it, right? Because the concept of autonomy in a modern colonial sense, the French themselves only start practicing it in the middle of the 20th century. And that gives you a sense of how far in advance Toussaint Louverture was from his own contemporaries. And there are dozens of other examples like that. But if I had to say just one thing, it's this. That singles him out. It's his capacity to think not just synthetically, but to take these syntheses and do something really original with them.
Let me use that point, Sudhir, if I may, to follow up with our first question that's come in from Chris. I think that's come in via, not YouTube, but one of our, I think probably through Facebook, actually. Well, Chris asks, how do we know about his personal qualities? And I suppose I'd expand that to say, you talked about the amazing array of material you were able to draw on. Could you give us a sense of the craft? I mean, how do you reconstruct this life of 200 years ago? What did the materials give you? And perhaps frustratingly, what did they leave out?
Well, starting with what they left out, I mean, we have just thousands of actual documents in the French colonial archives, because of course, Toussaint was a French civil servant. You know, he's a colonial administrator and a French army officer. And what we know about civil servants, and especially French civil servants, is that they write a lot, right? They leave a big track record. So, you know, decrees, speeches, all of that kind of stuff. There's a lot of material there from the 1790s. What we don't have, we have hardly anything about Toussaint's life during the first 50 years of his life, when he was a slave and when he lived on the Breda plantation. We literally have a handful of things. So we don't even know, for example, when exactly he was emancipated. We know that he was. We think it's sometime around the mid-1770s, but the formal document isn't there. So that's the big difference. But in terms of how we know, the other source for knowing and getting to understand him is his correspondence. Because at the height of his power, he dictated about 200 letters a day. Unfortunately, not all of them have survived, but enough have survived to give you a sense of what kind of person he is, because it's an absolutely marvelous source.
I have to say that gives some of our email loads a certain sense of perspective. Dictating in the old-fashioned style, 200 letters a day is quite something. We have a question coming in from Kobe Teacher, which is about the wider context. And Kobe asks, was the French Revolution important for the Haitian Revolution because of the ideals that it spread, the values, or was it the instability and distraction that it caused the colonial authorities that provided an opportunity? So is it a pragmatic or really a values-driven connection between the two?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, what basically happens is that the French Revolution creates the opening. And in fact, it creates the expectations, which are then frustrated. Because, of course, when the French proclaim liberty, equality, and fraternity in France, they immediately add the proviso that actually these principles are not going to apply to the colony, and particularly to their slaves. So the French Revolution actually in the first 2 years does nothing about slavery except to tell the white settlers, you can keep your slaves and everything will be fine. So the slaves then take matters into their own hands and start their own revolution in 1791. And that revolution is inspired in part by French revolutionary principles, but not only French revolutionary principles, because by the late 18th century, slaves have been revolting and doing so on the basis of a much richer set of traditions that are, if you like, local, right? So that's where I think one should not overstate the extent to which the French Revolution is an influence on the Haitian Revolution. But when you look at the 1790s, I think the tragedy of the Haitian Revolution is that as it gains momentum, as it becomes stronger, as Toussaint Louverture consolidates his grip over power during the second half of the 1790s, the French Revolution is becoming more and more conservative and even reactionary, right? And that is what culminates in Napoleon's coup d'etat and the French decision to restore slavery. So it's sad and unfortunate that if the Santo Domingans had better allies in France at the right moment, perhaps their own revolution could have prospered.
Now, on that question of enslavement, we have a question coming in on YouTube from Najmun Nahar, and actually this leads to one of the ambiguities, I think, to put it one way, that is in the biographies there in the life. Did Toussaint himself own slaves, and more broadly, was his attitude towards them in some ways quite more ambiguous than his Spartacus status might suggest.
He did own slaves. We have some evidence that he did. I mean, not very many and not for very long. But of course, he was the coachman on a very big plantation, and in that sense, he was actually part of a system of administering the plantation, which therefore included running slaves. So, I don't think there was really any serious option when you lived under slavery. I mean, either you ran away, I suppose. Right? You could do what, you could engage in what was called marronage. You could escape from the plantation and live in the woods or hide in plain sight in cities. But the strategy that Toussaint chose is what I would call an insider strategy, which is a strategy that was actually followed by many of what you might call the slave elite, particularly in the north of Saint-Domingue. What you start to see happening from the late 1780s already is that this elite, the slave drivers, the coachmen, the artisans on the plantations, they start to meet in secret and they start to plan the insurrection. The insurrection is something that doesn't just happen spontaneously in 1791. It had been happening because these slave drivers and coachmen and artisans had been working towards it for several years. And that was the way in which Toussaint thought best to challenge the system of slavery, to stay within it, but to build sufficient strength so that they could kind of explode it from within, as it were. That was the strategy that he followed.
Well, let me use that to bring in a couple of questions that come in about the kind of context on the social specifics, you might say, of the Haitian uprising. So a question comes in from PL, and that asks, what allowed Haiti to succeed when Brazilian former slave cities or Jamaican risings, for instance, got crushed? Was he lucky to live on an island, or is there, a factor beyond that?
That's a really great question. I mean, I think there are a number of factors. One is just the sheer numbers. As I mentioned, I think in my talk, when you have 500,000 black slaves and only 30,000 white settlers, and I think you can add the mixed race people as well, because one shouldn't forget a quarter of the slaves were owned by mixed race people. Right? They were part of the system as well. So initially, it's the fact that there is this huge favorable correlation of forces on the side of the slaves. But I think there's two other factors. One is military organization, military skill. One of the things that is very striking about the Saint-Domingue revolutionaries is that they combine, I mean, I come back to this point about synthesis. They combine, if you like, African guerrilla tactics. And guerrilla, by the way, as we know, is a word that comes to us via Europe and via the Napoleonic War in Spain. But when you look at the way the slaves are fighting in Saint-Domingue in the 1790s, they already are. I mean, they don't have this word for it, but they're engaging in guerrilla tactics already. And this comes from their African training. But it's a combination of that with European military skills. And Toussaint is the embodiment of that synthesis, because he's someone who's able to combine these two sets of skills and forge an incredibly powerful war machine that defeats the Spaniards and the French, and defeats the Brits too. By the way, the Brits are a really important part of this story. I didn't have time to mention them, but between 1793 and 1798, Pitt basically tries his best to capture Saint-Domingue and restore slavery. He spends, he sends 20,000 men there, spends 10 million pounds, and they are defeated and crushed and have to leave in 1798. So all of that, I think, is also a tribute to the importance, not just of this military culture, but also of leadership. What the thing that distinguishes the Saint-Domingue Revolution is that it produces these remarkable leaders like Toussaint, not just Toussaint, but Toussaint particularly.
I think actually your just last answer just now, Sudhir, answered a question that came in from Liao Yongxi, but I'm going to just shout out to him. He says, hi from Malaysia. He asked, why was the Haitian Revolution successful? I think you've answered that, but let me give you another sort of related question that plays rather nicely off the end of what you said there about the specificity of the fighters in Saint-Domingue. This is from Alan, or possibly Alan, if it's authentic Welsh pronunciation. And Alan is asking, you rightly emphasize Toussaint's heroism, but like his antagonist Napoleon, he was, it seems, a figure of great ruthlessness. Thinking of post-colonial leaders of the 20th century, is there a necessary streak of violence to such freedom fighters? And he gives a counterexample. Cuddlier figures like Pascal Paoli in Corsica don't seem to have done as well.
Yes, well, I think when you are living in an age of revolution, and when you have the imperial and colonial powers lined up against you, you have to be first. You have to be prepared to use force, and you have to be prepared to defend the revolution. Sometimes even by being quite ruthless. And in that sense, I don't think Toussaint is any fundamentally different from the other great revolutionaries of his time. Or, if you could compare him to someone like Bolivar a little later, or Bonaparte. It's interesting to try and see the similarities and differences with Bonaparte, but in some respects they are similar. They are military and administrative geniuses. They have a rare capacity for synthesizing things and having this strategic vision, and they're very determined, and they're very ruthless. And I think they succeeded in different ways, but all these ingredients were necessary, I think, in order for them to be able to do what they wanted to do. And I think we would say the same thing about modern revolutionaries. The revolutionaries that succeed are the ones like Lenin, like Mao, like Fidel, who, are prepared to do what it takes.
Well, I wonder if that brings us near the end, Sudhir, to a rather good question from Sarah, which brings us also to the rather tragic end of Toussaint's story, because she says, I think I remember reading that it all went really badly in the end for Toussaint. Is that right? Can you talk more about that? I mean, just to fast forward a bit, he ends up, of course, imprisoned in a cell in the Jura. And I suppose the corollary question that might, taking on Sarah's question and finishing us off is in the end someone who, is in the end defeated and taken off to France still to be counted with 200 years distance as a successful revolutionary? In other words, does his personal fate need to be considered separately from the fate of the forces that he unleashed?
Thank you. Well, I think by the time he's defeated, he's already unleashed the War of National Liberation, which is then fought by his own disciples and associates, notably Jean-Jacques Dessalines, to a successful conclusion. And he's captured by the French treacherously. He signed a truce with them, and basically his intention was to use the truce to both to consolidate his own position and to allow the elements to wear the French down, as they had worn the British down in the 1790s. So he was playing a kind of delaying game, but the French, got the better of him there, captured him and took him away. But the point is, all the strategic thinking that goes into the successful War of National Liberation that the Haitians fight successfully, all of those elements come from Toussaint, right? The scorched earth policy, the unification of the military leadership. Toussaint was always someone who wanted Black people and mixed race people to work together. And they hadn't been working together until the middle of 1802. And after Toussaint is out of the picture, Dessalines actually brings the Black commanders and the mixed race commanders together. And it's a joint struggle of the Black and the mixed race people against the invaders. So I would say the operational principles that led to the success of the Haitian Revolution were Toussaint's principles.
And in the end, as you say, that ability of different races and different groups to work together may be part of the legacy in retrospect that he's left behind.
Yes, absolutely. And if it may be a bit of a stretch, but I'll try this analogy anyway.
Go on.
If we talk about civil rights and we talk about Martin Luther King, we don't say that Martin Luther King failed because he died at that particular moment, do we? Right? I mean, you have to look at what happens in terms of the aftermath, you have to look at what happens in terms of the movement that is created, and you have to look at the impact that his life had. And I think in that sense, there is actually quite a compelling analogy, because Toussaint and the Haitian Revolution create this extraordinary movement, which, resonates across the 19th and the 20th century through anti-slavery and anti-colonial movements all over the Atlantic. And that, I think, is an important measure of posthumous success.
And that's a wonderful note for us to end this discussion on, Sudhir, but a reminder to everyone that the book is Black Spartacus, and you can read in far more detail all the wonderful elements of it that Sudhir has touched upon today. So many thanks indeed to you for sharing your time with us today on Oxford at Home. Please remember that you can find all our previous Oxford at Home talks online from Series 1 and Series 2. And do remember that you can join us also next week, same time, 12:45 GMT on Friday, 5th of March, and it will be on the subject of pain. But don't turn off. It's a painful subject, but it'll be delivered absolutely fascinatingly by Professor Irene Tracy, who is Oxford's Nuffield Chair in Anaesthetic Science. So she can make the pain go away. And if that's something that's not worth tuning in for, I don't know what is. Thank you again to Sudhir. Thank you for our audience from around the world tuning in to Oxford at Home, and look forward to seeing you here same time next week.